Commander Zixtal clicked his mandibles in what passed for amusement among the hegemony forces as he reviewed the intelligence reports flooding his tactical display. The third moon of Kepler 442c stretched below their massive dreadnought, its surface scarred by 3 weeks of orbital bombardment. What remained of the human colony's defense grid sparked and died in the thin atmosphere. "Another primitive world falls to the might of the hegemony," announced Sub-Commander Thecaron, his scaled hide glistening under the bridge's amber lighting. "The humans barely managed to scratch our shields before their pathetic fleet was eliminated." Zixtal's 4 eyes studied the final surrender transmission that had arrived an hour ago. The human colony administrator, a trembling female with strange pale skin and stringy yellow hair, had begged for mercy. Standard protocol demanded complete extermination of any species that dared resist the hegemony's expansion, but something in the data streams caught his attention. The colony records showed a population of roughly 50,000 humans spread across 12 settlements. Yet their resistance had been surprisingly organized for such a small number. Their ships, while technologically inferior, had employed tactics that cost the hegemony more vessels than anticipated. 3 light cruisers and an entire squadron of fighters had been lost to what should have been a simple cleanup operation. "Sir, we're receiving another transmission from the surface," reported Communications Officer Vectar, his tentacles dancing across the sensor array. "It's not from the administrator this time." Zixtal's primary eyes swiveled toward the main display as a new figure appeared. This human was different from the administrator. Where she had been soft and pleading, this one stood straight despite obvious injuries. Dark liquid that must be blood streaked down his face from a gash above one eye. His clothing was torn and scorched, suggesting he had been in the thick of the fighting. "I am Captain Marcus Chen, of the Terran Colonial Defense Force," the human said, his voice steady despite his planet's dire situation. "I wish to propose a formal duel under the Galactic Combat Accords, Article 7. A ripple of surprised chittering spread across the hegemony bridge. The Galactic Combat Accords were ancient laws that predated the current war by several centuries. Established when dozens of species still maintained independent governments. Article 7 allowed for single combat to determine the fate of a world when one side faced overwhelming odds. "This primitive doesn't understand what he's asking," laughed Thekron. "The Accords require that both combatants be of roughly equal technological capability. Their entire species hasn't even achieved faster-than-light travel without stealing our technology." But Zixtal found himself intrigued. The Accords did indeed allow for such challenges, though they hadn't been invoked in over 200 years. More importantly, accepting would provide excellent entertainment for his crew, who had grown bored with the ease of recent conquests. A public execution disguised as honorable combat would serve as perfect propaganda to discourage other human worlds from resisting. "State your terms, human," Zixtal commanded, activating the ship's communication array to broadcast to the entire fleet. Marcus Chen straightened further, and something in his eyes reminded Zixtal of a predator cornered but not yet defeated. "Single combat between myself and your chosen champion. Hand-to-hand combat only, no technological enhancements beyond basic personal armor. If I win, your forces withdraw from this system and leave our people in peace. If your champion wins, we surrender unconditionally and will not resist evacuation or whatever fate you deem appropriate." The audacity of the proposal sent another wave of amusement through the bridge crew. This small, injured human actually believed he could defeat a hegemony warrior in personal combat. The average hegemony soldier stood over 8 feet tall, possessed natural armor plating, and had been genetically enhanced for combat effectiveness over thousands of generations. "You realize," Zixtal said slowly, "that my smallest warrior outweighs you by at least 100 pounds and has natural weapons you could never match?" "I understand the odds," Marcus replied simply. those are my terms. Do you accept, or are the mighty hegemony forces afraid to face one injured human?" The challenge in those words was unmistakable, and Zixtal knew his crew was watching for his response. To refuse would suggest weakness, something that could undermine his authority. Besides, the outcome was certain. This would be over quickly, and the human's brave but futile gesture would make excellent footage for the hegemony's propaganda broadcasts. "I accept your challenge," Zixtal declared, his voice booming across the fleet communications. "Combat will take place in 2 hours on the main landing platform of Settlement 7. I will personally serve as your opponent." It was not entirely true. While Zixtal was indeed a formidable warrior, he had no intention of risking himself against an unknown opponent, regardless of how outmatched that opponent appeared. Sub-Commander Thekron was nearly identical to Zixtal in build and coloring, and had been enhanced with the latest combat modifications. The deception would never be detected by the primitive human sensors. As the transmission ended, Zixtal began planning the spectacle. The combat would be broadcast live to every world in this sector, showing the futility of resistance against hegemony forces. The humans' courage would be acknowledged just before it was crushed, demonstrating both the honor and the overwhelming power of their conquerors. But as he reviewed Marcus Chen's service record, pulled from the colony's captured databases, a small seed of unease began to grow in his mind. The human had served in something called the Special Operations Division before joining the Colonial Defense Force. His record showed deployments to 17 different worlds, most of which had faced various forms of armed conflict. "Probably just policing actions against other primitive humans," Thekron commented when Zixtal shared this information. "Their species is known for fighting among themselves over trivial resources." Still, Zixtal found himself studying the humans' combat footage from the recent battle. Marcus had been present during the final ground assault on Settlement 7, and the tactical recordings showed him moving with a fluidity and precision that seemed unusual for his species. He had disabled 3 hegemony soldiers with what appeared to be improvised weapons before being forced to retreat. "Sir, the human has arrived at the designated combat zone," Vectar reported. "He appears to be alone and is carrying minimal equipment." The main display showed Settlement 7's landing platform, a flat expanse of reinforced concrete surrounded by the smoking ruins of what had once been a bustling spaceport. Marcus Chen stood in the center of the platform, having somehow acquired clean clothing and basic armor. The armor was clearly human-made, lacking the sophisticated materials and design of hegemony equipment, but it covered his vital areas adequately. What struck Zixtal as odd was the human's demeanor. Rather than showing signs of fear or desperation, Marcus appeared calm and focused. He moved through a series of stretching exercises with the methodical precision of someone preparing for routine physical activity rather than a life-or-death battle. "Perhaps he doesn't truly understand what he's facing," suggested Navigation Officer Kelkor. "His species may lack the cognitive capacity to fully grasp the futility of his situation." But Zixtal's unease continued to grow as he watched Marcus complete his preparations. The human's movements suggested extensive training in personal combat, and there was something about his positioning on the platform that indicated tactical awareness. He had chosen a spot that maximized his mobility while minimizing potential cover for his opponent. As the designated time approached, Zixtal made final preparations for the deception. Thekron had been briefed on Zixtal's fighting style and mannerisms, ensuring the substitution would be undetectable. The sub-commander's recent genetic enhancements included improved reflexes, enhanced strength, and modified bone density that made him nearly indestructible by human standards. "Remember," Zixtal instructed as Thekron prepared to transport down to the surface, "make it quick, but not too quick. We want the humans to see their champion make a valiant effort before being inevitably crushed. Good propaganda requires the illusion of hope before the demonstration of reality." Thekron's mandibles clicked in acknowledgement. "It will be done, Commander. The human will provide adequate entertainment before his destruction." As the transport beam engaged, Zixtal settled back to watch what he expected to be a brief and conclusive demonstration of hegemony superiority. Around him, the bridge crew made small wagers on how long the human would last against their champion. None of them had bothered to research what special operations meant in human military terminology, or to investigate why a supposedly primitive species would need soldiers trained for unconventional warfare across multiple worlds. They had dismissed the humans as just another weak species to be easily conquered, filing them alongside dozens of other races that had fallen before the hegemony's advance. As Thekron materialized on the platform below, appearing to the human as Commander Zixtal himself, Marcus Chen turned to face his opponent with the same calm focus he had maintained throughout the preparations. In the hegemony ship above, confidence ran high that this would be over within minutes. They were about to discover just how wrong they could be about a species they had chosen to underestimate. Thekron materialized on the landing platform with the characteristic shimmer of hegemony transport technology, his imposing form casting a long shadow across the scarred concrete. Standing over 8 feet tall and weighing nearly 400 pounds of enhanced muscle and natural armor, he represented the pinnacle of hegemony genetic engineering. Razor-sharp bone spurs protruded from his knuckles and elbows, while his thick hide could turn aside most primitive weapons. Marcus Chen remained motionless as his opponent appeared, studying the alien warrior with the detached analytical gaze of a professional soldier. In the 2 hours since proposing this duel, he had used the colony's remaining surveillance equipment to observe hegemony troop movements and combat patterns. What he had learned was both encouraging and troubling. The hegemony forces relied heavily on their technological superiority and physical advantages, but their tactical approach showed signs of overconfidence that could be exploited. Their soldiers moved with the swagger of conquerors who had never faced serious resistance, suggesting they had grown complacent through easy victories. "I am Commander Zixtal of the Hegemony Third Fleet," Thekron announced, his voice amplified by the suit's communication systems. "You have shown courage in proposing this combat, human. I will ensure your death is swift and honorable." Marcus nodded respectfully, understanding the political theater aspect of this moment. Every word and gesture was being recorded for broadcast across the hegemony's territory, intended to demonstrate both their honor and their inevitable victory. "Captain Marcus Chen, Terran Colonial Defense Force," he replied formally. "I appreciate the opportunity to determine my people's fate through personal combat rather than bombardment." What Thekron could not know was that Marcus had spent the preparation time doing more than simply stretching and equipment checks. Using his extensive special operations training, he had analyzed the platform environment and identified several factors that might provide tactical advantages despite his apparent physical disadvantage. The landing platform's surface, while appearing smooth, actually contained subtle variations in texture and elevation that could affect footing. The afternoon sun cast distinct shadow patterns that could be used for positioning and misdirection. Most importantly, the platform's edges were not uniform barriers, but contained maintenance access points and equipment housings that could serve as improvised weapons or obstacles. As the two combatants faced each other across the designated fighting area, the differences between them seemed almost comically extreme. Thekron's natural weapons gleamed in the sunlight, and his enhanced physiology was clearly visible even through his basic combat armor. Marcus appeared small and fragile by comparison, his human-made equipment primitive and inadequate. "Begin when ready," came Zixtal's voice from the orbiting ship, broadcast to both combatants and to the watching fleets above. Thekron immediately launched into what the hegemony considered standard combat doctrine for dealing with smaller opponents. He charged forward with devastating speed, intending to use his superior reach and mass to overwhelm Marcus before the human could establish any defensive position. His bone spurs extended fully as he closed the distance, aiming to end the fight with a single crushing blow. But Marcus was no longer where Thekron expected him to be. Years of combat experience across 17 different worlds had taught Marcus to read an opponent's intentions from their initial movements. The Hegemony Warrior's attack, while powerful and fast by most standards, followed a predictable pattern that suggested over-reliance on physical advantages rather than tactical flexibility. Instead of attempting to block or dodge backwards, Marcus had moved diagonally forward and to the left, using Thekron's momentum against him while positioning himself outside the alien's primary attack arc. As the Hegemony Warrior's claws slashed through empty air where Marcus had been standing, the human delivered a precise strike to a joint in Thekron's knee armor. The impact was not powerful enough to cause serious damage, but it forced Thekron to adjust his balance and revealed something important. The Hegemony armor, while sophisticated, had the same basic vulnerabilities as any protective system. The joints required flexibility to allow movement, creating potential weak points for a combatant skilled enough to exploit them. Thekron spun around with impressive speed, his secondary arms extending to catch Marcus in a grappling hold. But again, the human had already moved, this time dropping low and sweeping at the alien's other leg. This attack also failed to cause significant damage, but it established a pattern that began to concern the watching Hegemony officers. "The human is faster than anticipated," observed Sub-Commander Velkath from the ship's bridge, "but he lacks the strength to penetrate our champion's defenses." Zixtal said nothing, but his concern was growing. Thekron should have ended this fight within the first exchange, yet somehow the small human was not only avoiding destruction, but actually maintaining the initiative. More troubling was the purposeful nature of Marcus's movements. These were not desperate survival instincts, but calculated tactics. On the platform below, Thekron was beginning to experience something unfamiliar: frustration. His training had prepared him to fight opponents who would either try to match his strength or flee in terror. This human was doing neither. Instead, Marcus seemed to be treating the duel as a learning exercise, probing for weaknesses while avoiding decisive confrontation. "Stand still and fight!" Thekron roared, launching another charge with his arms spread wide to prevent lateral escape. Marcus did indeed stand his ground this time, but not in the way the Hegemony Warrior expected. As Thekron closed in for what should have been a crushing embrace, Marcus dropped to one knee and drove both fists upward into the alien's solar plexus. The attack struck at the precise junction where Thekron's natural armor plates met, finding a gap that anatomy made unavoidable. The impact drove the air from Thekron's lungs and caused him to double over involuntarily. Before he could recover, Marcus had rolled between his legs and delivered a series of rapid strikes to the back of the alien's knees, targeting the same joint he had tested earlier, but now with greater force and precision. This time, something gave way with an audible crack. Thekron stumbled forward, his left leg no longer supporting his full weight properly. For the first time in the combat, he showed signs of actual damage rather than mere inconvenience. The bridge of the Hegemony ship fell silent as the impossible became undeniable. Their champion, enhanced with the latest genetic modifications and equipped with natural weapons that should have made him unstoppable against any primitive opponent, was being systematically dismantled by a human who appeared to be fighting with nothing more than basic hand-to-hand combat techniques. "How is this possible?" whispered Communications Officer Vektar. "The human's attacks shouldn't be penetrating our warriors' defenses." But Zixtal was beginning to understand what they were witnessing. This was not a desperate civilian fighting for his life, or even a standard soldier following basic training protocols. Marcus Chen moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years studying how to neutralize superior opponents through technique rather than strength. Every strike targeted specific vulnerabilities in anatomy or equipment. Every movement was calculated to maintain optimal positioning while denying Thekron the ability to bring his advantages to bear effectively. This was the work of a professional warrior, someone whose entire career had been built around overcoming impossible odds through skill and intelligence. On the platform, Thekron was learning the same lesson. His initial contempt for the human opponent had given way to grudging respect, then to genuine concern, as he realized that his usual tactics were not merely ineffective, but actually counterproductive. Each time he attempted to use brute force, Marcus found a way to redirect that energy against him. The turning point came when Thekron, growing desperate as his mobility decreased due to the damaged knee, attempted to end the fight with a massive overhead strike using both primary arms. The attack carried enough force to crater the concrete platform, but Marcus had anticipated it based on the alien's positioning and body language. Instead of dodging away, Marcus stepped in close, catching Thekron's arms at the wrists and using leverage to redirect the devastating blow into the platform's surface. The impact sent shockwaves through both combatants. But while Thekron was committed to the motion and off balance, Marcus was positioned to flow with the energy. As chunks of concrete flew in all directions, Marcus used the chaos to position himself behind his opponent. A precise strike to the base of Thekron's neck, delivered with all the accumulated technique of years of special operations training, found the exact nerve cluster that would temporarily paralyze the alien's upper body. Thekron collapsed to his knees, his arms hanging useless at his sides. He was not permanently injured, but he was completely unable to continue fighting. The enhanced physiology that made him such a formidable warrior had been turned against him by someone who understood exactly how nervous systems functioned across different species. Marcus stepped back, breathing heavily but still alert, ready to continue if necessary. But the fight was clearly over. The hegemony champion knelt helpless on the shattered platform, defeated not through superior strength or technology, but through the application of skill and knowledge. In the orbiting ship above, the stunned silence stretched for long moments before Zixtal found his voice. "Impossible," he whispered, staring at the display showing his defeated champion. "Absolutely impossible." But the evidence was undeniable. A single human, equipped with primitive armor and no advanced weapons, had systematically defeated one of the hegemony's finest warriors. Everything they thought they knew about this species had just been proven catastrophically wrong, and Marcus Chen was not yet finished with his surprises. The silence aboard the hegemony flagship stretched for nearly a full minute as the implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Zixtal stared at the tactical display showing Thekron kneeling helpless on the platform below, his mind struggling to process how their supposedly inevitable victory had turned into an impossible defeat. "Sir," Communications Officer Vektar finally ventured, his tentacles trembling as they worked the controls, "what are your orders?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. According to the Galactic Combat Accords, the duel was over, and Marcus Chen had won. The terms were clear. The hegemony forces would withdraw from the system and leave the human colony in peace. But accepting defeat at the hands of a single primitive human would have consequences that extended far beyond this one world. Word of this outcome would spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. Every subjugated species would hear that the mighty hegemony had been bested in personal combat by a member of a race they had dismissed as weak and technologically inferior. The psychological impact on their empire could be devastating. "This changes nothing," Zixtal declared, though his voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. "One human defeating one warrior proves nothing about their species as a whole. We will honor the letter of the Accords by withdrawing our forces. But this system remains under hegemony oversight." But even as he spoke the words, Zixtal knew they sounded hollow. Sub-Commander Velkath's expression suggested similar doubts, and the bridge crew exchanged uncertain glances. Everything they had been taught about the natural order of the galaxy had just been challenged by what they had witnessed. On the platform below, Marcus Chen approached the paralyzed Thekron with obvious caution. He had no way of knowing how long the nerve strike would remain effective, or whether the alien possessed backup systems that might allow for recovery. Years of fighting in hostile environments had taught him never to assume an enemy was truly defeated until they were either dead or securely restrained. "Can you understand me?" Marcus asked, kneeling beside the hegemony warrior but maintaining enough distance to react if necessary. Thekron's eyes tracked to focus on the human, and he managed a slight nod. The paralysis affected his motor functions, but left his sensory capabilities intact. "Good," Marcus continued. "The paralysis is temporary. You'll regain full mobility within an hour, though you may experience some lingering soreness. I want you to understand that I took no pleasure in this combat, and I harbor no personal animosity toward you or your people." The alien's expression showed confusion, as if the concept of showing consideration to a defeated enemy was foreign to him. In hegemony culture, victory typically meant complete domination or destruction of the opposition. "I studied your combat patterns during the recent battle," Marcus explained, his voice carrying easily in the thin atmosphere. "Your people are formidable warriors, but you fight like conquerors who have never faced serious resistance. That makes you predictable to someone trained in asymmetric warfare." Above them, Zixtal was monitoring the conversation through enhanced audio pickups, and Marcus's words sent another chill through the bridge crew. This human had studied their tactics and found weaknesses that could be exploited. If one human could do this, what might an entire military force of such beings accomplish? "Commander," Sub-Commander Velkath said quietly, "perhaps we should investigate this human's background more thoroughly before making any final decisions." Zixtal nodded grimly and activated his personal data terminal. The human colony's databases had been captured intact, providing access to detailed records about their population. He began pulling up everything available about Marcus Chen, and what he found made his stomach turn cold. Captain Marcus Chen, age 34, had indeed served in the Terran Special Operations Division for 12 years before joining the Colonial Defense Force. But the term Special Operations was a massive understatement of what that service had entailed. The records showed deployments to 17 different worlds, but those deployments had not been simple peacekeeping missions. Marcus had fought in the Proxima Centauri mining conflicts against automated defense systems that made hegemony technology look primitive. He had participated in the liberation of New Geneva from the Silicon Hive, an artificial intelligence that had enslaved an entire planet. He had led commando raids against the crystalline hegemony's advanced outposts in the Vale Nebula, but most disturbing of all were the records of his service during humanity's first contact with the Zarathi Empire. The Zarathi were a spacefaring species with technology comparable to the hegemony, and they had attempted to conquer Earth through a massive invasion fleet. According to the files, Marcus had been part of a small team that infiltrated the Zarathi flagship and disabled their entire command structure from within. The war had ended not through superior human firepower, but through surgical strikes by special operations teams who understood that technological superiority meant nothing if you could not protect your critical vulnerabilities from skilled infiltrators. "Sir," Velkath's voice was barely above a whisper, "these humans appear to have defeated several species with technology equal to or superior to our own." The implications were staggering. The hegemony had dismissed humanity as a primitive species based on their apparent lack of advanced technology, but the record suggested something far more dangerous. A species that had learned to defeat superior opponents through tactics, intelligence, and individual skill rather than through technological advancement. On the platform below, Marcus was helping Thekron into a more comfortable position as sensation slowly returned to the alien's limbs. "Your empire made the same mistake that others have made," Marcus said conversationally. "You assumed that technology determines military capability, but throughout human history, superior technology has been defeated by superior tactics and training more often than not." He gestured toward the smoking ruins of the spaceport around them. "Your bombardment destroyed our infrastructure and eliminated our heavy weapons, but it also gave us information about your capabilities and methods. Every shot you fired told us something about your targeting priorities, your weapon limitations, and your tactical doctrines." Thekron managed to speak, his voice rough but audible. "You studied us like prey." "We studied you like students," Marcus corrected. "Humans have a saying, 'Know your enemy and know yourself, and you need not fear the result of 100 battles.' Your people are powerful, but power without wisdom leads to overconfidence. Overconfidence leads to mistakes. And mistakes can be fatal even for the strongest opponent." Above them, Zixtal was rapidly reviewing tactical assessments of the human colonies throughout this sector. What he had initially seen as easy conquest targets now looked like potential death traps. If every human settlement contained soldiers with training similar to Marcus Chen, then the hegemony forces were walking into a nightmare. "Sir," Navigation Officer Kelkor reported, "we're receiving priority communications from Hegemony Central Command. They're requesting immediate status reports from all fleets in human territory." The request was not unexpected. The duel had been broadcast live across the Hegemony communication network, and news of the defeat would be spreading rapidly. Central Command would want to know if this represented an isolated incident or a fundamental intelligence failure about human capabilities. Zixtal found himself faced with a decision that could determine the future of the war. He could report this as an anomaly, a single unusual human who did not represent his species as a whole. That would allow the invasion to continue and might preserve his own career and reputation. Or he could report what the evidence actually suggested, that the hegemony had catastrophically underestimated their opponents and was about to suffer massive casualties if the current strategy continued. On the platform below, Thekron was struggling to his feet with Marcus's assistance. The human could have left his defeated opponent paralyzed and helpless, but instead was providing aid and treating him with the respect due to a worthy adversary. "Why help me?" Thekron asked, confusion clear in his voice. Marcus shrugged. "Because the fight is over, and you're no longer my enemy. In human culture, we have a concept called honor in defeat. You fought bravely according to your training and beliefs. That deserves respect regardless of the outcome." The alien warrior studied Marcus with new understanding. "Your species fights not from hatred, but from necessity." "Usually," Marcus agreed. "We prefer peace when it's possible, but we've learned to be very good at war when it's necessary. Your empire chose to make it necessary." As Thekron regained enough mobility to stand unassisted, he looked around at the devastated spaceport with fresh eyes. What he had initially seen as evidence of human weakness now appeared to be something else entirely: strategic sacrifice. The humans had allowed their infrastructure to be destroyed while preserving their most valuable asset, their trained personnel. "How many more like you are there?" Thekron asked. Marcus smiled grimly. "On this colony, about 200 former Special Operations personnel chose to settle here after their military service. Throughout human space, millions. We've been fighting impossible odds for so long that it's become our specialty." In the ship above, that conversation was being recorded and analyzed by the Hegemony intelligence officers, and their findings were deeply disturbing. If Marcus represented even a fraction of human military capability, then the invasion force was not just outnumbered but outmatched in the most critical area: experience in asymmetric warfare. "Commander," Subcommander Velkath said urgently. "I recommend we withdraw immediately and request reinforcements. This situation requires complete reevaluation." But even as Zixtal considered that option, he realized it might already be too late. Other human colonies throughout the sector would have received word of this victory by now. They would be preparing for the hegemony's arrival with the knowledge that their supposedly invincible opponents could be defeated. The war that the hegemony thought they had already won was about to become very different from what they had expected, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Zixtal began to wonder if they had made a mistake that would ultimately cost them not just this sector, but their entire empire. Marcus Chen stood on the platform, watching as hegemony transport beams began retrieving their forces from the surface below. The duel was over, and its terms had been honored. But both sides understood that this was not truly an ending. It was a beginning.